It begins with a melody that every child born in the English-speaking world in the last 60 years knows by heart. It is a gentle, lilting tune, played on nylon string guitars, sung in three-part harmony so pristine it sounds like it was recorded in a cathedral. It is a song about a dragon who lives by the sea. It is a song about a little boy named Jackie Paper. It is a song about string and sealing wax and other fancy stuff. It is the gold standard of children's music, a lullaby that has sent millions of toddlers to sleep. But if you were a teenager in the late 1960s or a college student in the 1970s, you knew something else. You knew the secret. You knew that this wasn't a song about a dragon. You knew that puff was a reference to taking a puff of a marijuana cigarette. You knew that Jackie Paper wasn't a boy, but a reference to rolling papers. You knew that the autumn mist wasn't weather, but smoke. And you knew that Honah Lee wasn't a fictional land, but a reference to the village of Honah Lee in Kauai, famous for its particularly potent strain of cannabis. This interpretation became one of the most pervasive, indestructible urban legends of the 20th century. It was a rumor that started as a joke in a news magazine, spread through the dorm rooms of America like a contagion, and eventually hardened into a cultural fact. It became a wink-wink insider secret, a way for the counterculture to claim a piece of the mainstream and say, "They don't know, but we know." It turned a song about childhood innocence into an anthem for drug use. It forced the songwriters to spend decades defending themselves in courtrooms, in interviews, and on stages, pleading with the world to believe that a dragon is just a dragon. But the tragedy of Puff the Magic Dragon isn't just that it was misunderstood. The tragedy is that the lie was so loud, it drowned out the truth. And the truth of the song is far more profound, far more devastating, and far more universal than a cheap drug reference. This is not a story about marijuana. This is a story about the death of childhood. It is the story of a 19-year-old boy sitting in a university library, typing on a typewriter, terrified that he was growing up. It is the story of a poem that was never meant to be a hit, and a trio of folk singers who watched their most beautiful creation get hijacked by a culture war they didn't start. The rumor ruined the song's reputation, but the reality of the song, the secret that was actually hiding in plain sight, is the one thing that no one wanted to talk about. Because while drugs are a rebellious phase, the loss of innocence is a permanent scar. This is the anatomy of a myth. This is the story of how we took a beautiful, sad story about time passing and turned it into a joke about getting high. And it begins not in a smoke-filled room in San Francisco, but in the quiet, dusty stacks of a library at Cornell University in 1959. To understand the true DNA of Puff the Magic Dragon, you have to strip away the tie-dye, the patchouli oil, and the haze of the late 1960s. You have to travel back in time to a world where rock and roll was still a toddler and the concept of a hippie did not yet exist. The year is 1959. The location is Ithaca, New York, Cornell University. This is the era of Eisenhower. It is a time of button-down shirts, crew cuts, and serious academic pursuit. In a small student apartment, a 19-year-old engineering physics student named Leonard Lipton is sitting in front of a typewriter. Leonard Lipton is not a beatnik. He is not a counterculture revolutionary. He is a man of science, a student who would go on to become a pioneer in the field of stereoscopic vision and 3D projection technology. He is a man grounded in the laws of optics and physics. But on this particular snowy evening, Leonard Lipton is procrastinating. He is supposed to be studying, but his mind is wandering. He wanders to the library stacks, specifically to the poetry section, where he reads a poem by Ogden Nash titled The Tale of Custard the Dragon. Nash's poem is a light-hearted, humorous piece about a cowardly dragon who turns out to be brave. But Lipton, a sensitive young man standing on the precipice of adulthood, reads it and feels something else. He feels a pang of melancholy. He realizes that dragons, by their nature, belong to the realm of childhood. And childhood, by its nature, is a kingdom you are exiled from the moment you grow up. He walks back to his apartment, sits at his royal typewriter, and begins to type. He isn't writing a song, he is writing a poem. He pours his own anxiety about leaving his youth behind onto the page. He invents a dragon named Puff. He invents a little boy named Jackie Paper. Why paper? Decades later, conspiracy theorists would claim it was a reference to rolling papers for joints. The truth is far more literal and far more poetic. Lipton named him Jackie Paper because paper is fragile. Paper tears. Paper blows away in the wind. Paper is temporary. The dragon is eternal. The boy is disposable. Lipton finished the poem in 20 minutes. He left the page in the typewriter and walked away. He thought he was done with it. He thought it was just a moment of procrastination, a scribbled thought to be discarded. But Leonard Lipton had a housemate. That housemate was a tall, intense, guitar-playing psychology major named Peter Yarrow. Peter Yarrow was already a fixture in the burgeoning folk scene. He was a musical sponge, always looking for material. Sometime later, Yarrow walked past the typewriter. He saw the piece of paper. He read the poem. Where Lipton saw a melancholy scribble, Yarrow saw a ballad. He saw the structure of a classic folk tale. He sat down with his guitar, a Martin acoustic, and began to weave a melody around Lipton's words. He kept the verses almost exactly as Lipton had written them, but he added his own contribution. The chorus. Puff, the magic dragon, lived by the sea. Yarrow's melody was deceptively simple. It was a lullaby, sweet and major key, but it created a perfect, heartbreaking counterpoint to Lipton's lyrics. The music said safety, but the words said loss. Yarrow played the song for Lipton. Lipton liked it. But neither of them thought it was the start of a revolution. It was just a song written by two college kids in a snowy apartment. Lipton went back to his physics studies. Yarrow graduated and moved to Greenwich Village, taking the song with him in his guitar case. For 2 years, the song sat dormant. It was a parlor trick, a tune Yarrow would play for friends at parties. It was an artifact of their college days. But the world was changing fast. The folk revival was exploding in New York City. The village was becoming the epicenter of a new kind of music. Music that valued storytelling, authenticity, and acoustic purity. A manager named Albert Grossman, the man who managed Bob Dylan, had a vision. He wanted to create a supergroup of folk music. He wanted a tall, blonde icon, a funny, acerbic wit, and a soulful, beautiful female voice. He found Peter Yarrow. He found Noel Paul Stuckey. He found Mary Travers. He formed Peter, Paul, and Mary. They were an instant sensation. They were the polished, accessible face of the folk movement. They had the harmonies of angels and the political conviction of activists. Their debut album in 1962 was a juggernaut, spending 7 weeks at #1. They needed a follow-up. They needed a hit. And Peter Yarrow remembered the poem his physicist roommate had left in a typewriter back at Cornell. He brought Puff the Magic Dragon to the group. Paul Stuckey and Mary Travers added their voices. They built a 3-part harmony that lifted the simple lullaby into the stratosphere. They recorded it for their second album, Moving. When Puff the Magic Dragon was released as a single in 1963, it didn't just chart, it became a standard. It reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. It crossed over to R&B charts. It was played in nurseries, on radios, and at campfires across America. At that moment, in 1963, there was no controversy. There were no whispers. The drug culture that would define the late 60s was still in its infancy, restricted to jazz clubs and beatnik basements. To the mainstream public, Puff was exactly what Lipton and Yarrow intended it to be. A beautiful, sad song about the end of childhood innocence. It was a song about a dragon who lives forever, and a boy who grows up and stops visiting. It was Peter Pan with a tragic ending. The dragon doesn't die. The dragon is abandoned. Painted wings and giant rings make way for other toys. It was a metaphor for the moment you put down your teddy bear and never pick it up again. Leonard Lipton, the physics student, received a songwriting credit. The royalties from that procrastination would eventually pay for his research into 3D technology. It seemed like the perfect American success story. But the song was a time bomb. It had been released in the innocence of 1963, but it was about to live through 1964, 1965, and 1966. The world was about to lose its own innocence. And as the culture darkened, as the smoke cleared in the dorm rooms of the late 60s, a new generation would look at this children's song and decide that something so innocent simply could not be true. They decided that the dragon had to be a dealer. The transformation of Puff the Magic Dragon from a beloved lullaby into a subversive drug anthem didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen because of a confession or a leaked tape or a police raid. It happened because of a joke that landed in the wrong place, at the wrong time, in a culture that was suddenly desperate to find hidden meanings in everything. The patient zero of this cultural infection can be traced to a specific moment. While whispers had existed in dorm rooms, the rumor went nuclear thanks to the mainstream press. In 1964, Newsweek magazine published a feature on the growing trend of marijuana use on college campuses. In a sidebar, or perhaps as a cheeky throwaway line to demonstrate how pervasive the culture had become, the writer suggested that the innocent folk song currently climbing the charts might actually be a coded message. It was intended as sophisticated wit. It was read as investigative journalism. Suddenly, the code was broken. And once you heard the translation, it was impossible to unhear it. The logic of the rumor was seductive because it was so detailed. It wasn't just a vague feeling. It was a line-by-line decoding that seemed to fit perfectly if you squinted hard enough through a haze of smoke. Here is the indictment that was prosecuted in the court of public opinion. Puff, the rumor went, was obviously a reference to taking a puff of a joint. Magic Dragon was interpreted as drag in or inhaling the smoke. Jackie paper. That was the most damning evidence of all. Rolling papers, the autumn mist. That wasn't weather. It was the cloud of smoke in a room. Honah Lee. That wasn't a poetic, fictional village. It was a reference to Honah Lee, a town on the island of Kauai, Hawaii, which was rumored to grow a particularly potent strain of marijuana called Honah Lee Gold. Even the sealing wax was reinterpreted as a reference to the resin used to seal a pipe or a bong. To a generation of teenagers who were just discovering rebellion, this interpretation was intoxicating. It transformed a song their parents liked into a song their parents didn't understand. It gave the listener a sense of superior, secret knowledge. It was a cultural shibboleth. If you thought it was about a dragon, you were a square. If you knew it was about weed, you were cool. You were part of the club. The rumor spread with the speed of a contagion. It moved from Ivy League campuses to high schools, from high schools to middle schools. It became one of the first viral memes of the pre-internet age. But there was a fatal flaw in this logic, a chronological impossibility that the conspiracy theorists conveniently ignored. Leonard Lipton wrote the poem in 1959. Peter Yarrow wrote the song in 1959. In 1959, the drug culture that the song supposedly referenced simply did not exist in the way the rumors claimed. The term rolling papers wasn't mainstream slang for drug paraphernalia in a Cornell library in the Eisenhower era. Honah Lee Gold wasn't a known brand. Leonard Lipton was a physics nerd scared of growing up, not a drug kingpin encoding messages to the youth of America. But facts are powerless against a good story. By 1966, the rumor had hardened into rock-solid fact. The song was no longer seen as a piece of art. It was seen as a Trojan horse. For Peter, Paul, and Mary, the rumor was initially a nuisance. They laughed it off. They were serious folk musicians, activists who marched with Dr. King. The idea that their tender ballad about the loss of childhood was a stoner anthem seemed absurd. But the nuisance soon turned into a nightmare. As the 1960s turned darker, as the summer of love gave way to the riots of 1968 and the crackdown of the Nixon era, the interpretation of Puff began to have real-world consequences. Radio stations began to ban the song. In markets like Hong Kong and Singapore, where drug laws were draconian, the song was pulled from the airwaves completely. The Vice President of the United States, Spiro Agnew, famously launched a crusade against drug culture in music, citing songs that he believed were corrupting American youth. Puff was often lumped in with the Beatles' Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and the Byrds' 8 Miles High. The band found themselves in a bizarre, Kafkaesque situation. They were being accused of a crime they didn't commit, in a language they didn't speak, regarding a song they had written years before the alleged crime even existed. Peter Yarrow took the defense personally. For decades, at almost every concert, he would stop the show to address the rumor. He would stand on stage, his face serious, and plead with the audience. "I'd like to state for the record," he would say, "that Puff the Magic Dragon is not about drugs." He would often use humor to deflect the absurdity. "If I wanted to write a song about marijuana," he would tell the crowd, "I would have called it Marijuana." He argued passionately about the integrity of the songwriting. He pointed out that hiding a drug reference in a children's song would be sloppy writing. It would be cheap. It would rob the song of its emotional depth. "When you take a song that is about the sadness of the loss of innocence," Yarrow said, "and you turn it into a drug song, you steal the meaning. You drain the humanity out of it." But the audience would just giggle. They would wink. They thought his denial was part of the act. They thought he had to say that to keep the authorities off his back. The more he denied it, the more they believed it. It was the "Paul is dead" phenomenon of the folk world. The audience believed they knew the artist's intent better than the artist did. Meanwhile, Leonard Lipton, the physicist who had started it all, watched from the sidelines with a mixture of amusement and horror. He was now a respected scientist, developing the technology that would eventually be used in 3D cinema, including the Real D system used for movies like Avatar. Yet he was forever tethered to this rumor. He would tell interviewers repeatedly, "I was a 19-year-old kid. I was thinking about my childhood ending. I wasn't thinking about pot." The tragedy of the rumor was that it fundamentally altered the way the song was heard. When a listener puts on decoding ears, they stop listening with their heart. They stop feeling the sadness of Jackie Paper growing up. They stop feeling the devastation of the dragon slipping back into his cave. Instead, they are playing a game of spot the reference. The emotional resonance is severed. The song had been hijacked. The counterculture, in its eagerness to claim everything as its own, had taken a beautiful, fragile poem about the universal human experience of aging and graffiti-tagged it with a marijuana leaf. For Peter Yarrow, this was a source of genuine pain. He saw Puff as a tool for empathy, a way to help children and adults process the inevitable grief of change. To have that tool turned into a punchline was, in his eyes, a desecration. It wasn't until decades later, when the smoke finally cleared and the culture wars of the 60s faded into history, that the song could finally be heard again for what it actually was. But by then, the damage had been done. The dragon had been misunderstood for half a century. The rumor proved to be more durable than the band itself. Peter, Paul, and Mary broke up in 1970, reunited years later, and continued to tour for decades. But Puff was always the elephant, or rather the dragon, in the room. The battle for the song's soul continued well into the modern era. A poignant example of this struggle occurred in the late 1980s, involving another counterculture icon, Ben & Jerry's ice cream. The Vermont-based company, famous for its hippie ethos and pun-based flavors like Cherry Garcia, contacted Peter Yarrow. They wanted to release a new flavor. They were going to call it Puff the Magic Brownie. It was a clever marketing joke. It leaned heavily into the Munchies double entendre that the world associated with the song. For most artists, this would have been an easy paycheck, a moment of brand synergy. Peter Yarrow refused. He didn't just say no. He wrote a letter explaining why. He explained that by turning the character into a drug joke, they were stripping it of its dignity. They were taking a character that comforted children and turning it into a punchline for adults. Ben & Jerry's, to their credit, backed down. They respected the creator's intent. This incident highlights the core tragedy of the Puff phenomenon. The drug rumor is actually the safe interpretation. It is the easy way out. Think about it. If the song is about drugs, it's just a silly, subversive ditty about getting high. It's a joke. It has no stakes. But if the song is not about drugs, if the song is exactly what Leonard Lipton wrote in that library in 1959, then it is a song of profound, devastating heartbreak. Let's look at the lyrics that the decoders ignored. The emotional climax of the song isn't the autumn mist. It is the verse that usually makes children cry and makes parents choke up. A dragon lives forever, but not so little boys. Painted wings and giant rings make way for other toys. This is the thesis statement of the entire work. It is a brutal acknowledgement of mortality. It is the realization that childhood is a finite resource. One gray night it happened. Jackie Paper came no more. In the drug interpretation, this is dismissed as the boy getting sober or moving on to harder drugs. But in the literal interpretation, this is a death. It is the death of the child self. Jackie Paper didn't die physically. He grew up. He became John. He bought a suit. He got a job. He stopped visiting the sea. He forgot how to imagine. And Puff, that mighty dragon, he ceased his fearless roar. This is the consequence. Without the belief of the child, the magic dies. The dragon, the embodiment of wonder, of imagination, of that spark that makes the world seem limitless, is left alone. He slides into his cave. His green scales fall like rain. The drug rumor acted as a shield. It protected the listener from the genuine sadness of the song. It is easier to giggle about Honah Lee being a type of weed than it is to face the reality that you can never go back to being 7 years old. It is easier to be cynical than to be vulnerable. The verdict on Puff the Magic Dragon is that we, as a culture, failed the song. We were given a beautiful, melancholy masterpiece about the human condition, and we graffiti tagged it because we were uncomfortable with its sincerity. We chose the cheap laugh over the deep cry. In 2022, Leonard Lipton died at the age of 82. His obituary was a fascinating document of a dual life. It listed his massive, groundbreaking contributions to science. He was a physicist. He held dozens of patents. He created the crystallized shutter glasses. He wrote the definitive textbook on stereoscopic cinema. He was the reason you wore 3D glasses to see Avatar. He was a genius who changed the way we see the world literally, through the physics of optics. But the headline of almost every obituary was the same. Leonard Lipton, co-creator of Puff the Magic Dragon, dies. He made peace with it in the end. He realized that while his inventions changed technology, his procrastination poem had changed lives. He accepted that the dragon was his true legacy. And then, on January 7th, 2025, the final chapter of the partnership closed. Peter Yarrow, the man who took that poem from a typewriter and gave it wings, passed away at the age of 86. With Yarrow's death, the physical link to the song's origin is gone. The physicist who wrote the words and the activist who sang the melody have both left the stage. But in his final decades, Peter Yarrow achieved something remarkable. He reclaimed the song. If you watch footage of Yarrow's performances in his later years, you witness a profound cultural healing. He often played for audiences of baby boomers, the very people who had spread the drug rumors in their college dorms in 1968. But these weren't rebellious teenagers anymore. They were in their 70s. They had gray hair. They had grandchildren on their laps. When Yarrow would start to play those opening chords, the giggling would stop. The wink-wink irony that had plagued the song for 40 years would evaporate. These people who spent their youth treating the song as a joke suddenly heard it with new ears. They heard the line, "Jackie Paper came no more," and they didn't think about rolling papers. They thought about their own childhoods, which were now distant memories. They thought about their own children, who had grown up and left the house. They thought about the relentless, unstoppable passage of time. In those final concerts, you could see tears in the eyes of the audience. The drug rumor fell away, like a layer of grime being cleaned off an old painting, revealing the masterpiece underneath. The song was finally heard as it was intended, a prayer for the past. The story of Puff the Magic Dragon is a lesson in how folklore works. A story is created, it is distorted by the culture, it is mocked, and then, if it is true enough, it survives the mockery to become timeless. The rumor ruined the song's reputation for a generation, yes, but it couldn't kill it. Because the truth of the song, that painful, beautiful truth about the end of innocence, is stronger than any urban legend. Now, both Jackie Paper, Lipton, and the singer, Yarrow, have come no more. They have moved on to whatever lies beyond the sea of Honah Lee. But Puff? Puff is still there. He is waiting in the cave for the next child to find him. As long as there are children discovering the world, and as long as there are adults who remember what it was like to lose that discovery, the magic dragon will never truly be alone. These are the stories we tell here, the hidden histories, the debunked myths, and the emotional truths behind the music you think you know. If you want to join us as we peel back the layers of pop culture history, hit that subscribe button. because every song has a secret, and we're here to find them.